Hey everyone, let's talk about IRMAA. Now, this is the income-related monthly adjustment amount, which is a surcharge that's applied to your Part B and D Medicare premiums once your income passes certain levels. If you don't know the rules, these premium increases can take you by surprise and hit hard. So today, I want to go over how this works, and then later, I'm going to bring on an expert to tell you how, under certain circumstances, you can appeal the IRMAA and get the additional surcharge removed. You know, Medicare is a cheap form of insurance for most people. I know a lot of retirees who are counting down the days until they hit 65 so they can come off of their expensive plan where they're paying $1,000 or more and get on Medicare. The reason it's so cheap is that you paid for it throughout your working life through payroll taxes. In return for those payroll taxes, the federal government will typically pay for most of the premiums. So when it's time to go on Medicare, you only have to pay a percentage of the premium and the federal government picks up the rest. But if the IRMAA applies to you, the percentage you have to pay increases. Now, I know that in most of the discussions about the IRMAA, most people focus on the premiums for Part B. But what some people forget is that if the IRMAA applies, they'll also get an increase to their Part D prescription drug premium. Now, the reason Part B gets all the attention is that it's the highest in terms of dollars. This is the part of Medicare that covers doctor visits, lab work, physical therapy, surgeries, and a whole lot more too. The premium for Part B in 2022 is $170.10. So before we dive into the increases that can happen, let's talk about the pricing of Part B and how they determine what the annual premium is, because this is really the foundation of how premium increases will be applied. By law, the premiums for Part B have to cover 25% of the cost that will be incurred by that part of the program. So every year, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have to estimate the annual cost to pay for all of the services covered by Part B. Then they set the premium to 25% of this cost. This 25 to 75 ratio, where you pay 25% of the cost and the federal government pays 75% of the cost, is what the vast majority of those on Medicare are paying. But if your modified adjusted gross income increases beyond certain levels, that ratio starts to change and you have to pay a higher percentage of the program cost. Now, quick note here. For purposes of Medicare, your modified adjusted gross income is your adjusted gross income plus tax-exempt interest. Most of the government programs have different methods to calculate the MAGI, but thankfully, this version is fairly straightforward and easy to calculate. So there are 6 income thresholds, with each having a progressively higher percentage share of the program cost. To illustrate this, I'll use the 2022 thresholds for a couple who are married filing jointly. Now, I'll cover the singles in a moment as well. Now, if you are at or under $182,000, you pay the standard 25% of the program cost. That's just the standard premium. But once your income goes over $182,000, you'll pay at least 35% of the program cost. Once you go over $228,000, you'll pay 50%. Over $284,000, you'll pay 65%. Over $340,000, you'll pay 80%. And over $750,000, you'll pay 85% of the cost. Now, just using percentages certainly isn't all that enlightening, but I did want to show you the rationale behind the premium increases. And something that's very important to note, these thresholds are cliff brackets. If your income is even $1 over the threshold amount, you're going to be stuck with higher premiums. So let's put this into dollars and see how this works. The first thing to know is that they use your income from 2 years prior. For example, your 2022 premiums would be determined by looking at your 2020 tax return. This is because they'd make this determination in late 2021, and 2020 would be the latest and most current return they would have on file. Now, I'll talk about some of the challenges this presents in just a moment. Just know the income we are referencing for the 2022 premiums are based on your modified adjusted gross income from 2020. If you're under the first threshold amount, your Part B premium is $170.10, and there are no additional premiums added to your Part D. If your income falls in the second threshold, your Part B will increase to $238.10, and you'll have $12.40 added to your Part D premium. In the third threshold, your Part B will increase to $340.20, and you'll have $32.10 added to your Part D premium. In the fourth threshold, your Part B will increase to $442.30, and you'll have $51.70 added to your Part D premium. In the fifth threshold, your Part B will increase to $544.30, and you'll have $71.30 added to your Part D premium. In the sixth and final threshold, your Part B will increase to $578.30, and you'll have $77.90 added to your Part D premium. So you don't have to look at those numbers for very long to see that Medicare premiums can get really expensive. So it's important to avoid tripping into these accidentally. So how can you plan around them? Well, because of the way these are set up, it's not always easy. These thresholds change on an annual basis in response to inflation. At least most of the brackets do. The last thresholds, the $500 for singles and $750 for those married filing jointly, won't be changed for inflation until 2028, but all of the other brackets behind those are set to increase right along with the CPIU. Now, this brings about some challenges when you're trying to guess what the brackets will be in 2 years. So my suggestion is just to use the brackets that are in place for this year. So if you're trying to look forward to 2024, just use the brackets that you have now. That may be overly conservative, but keep in mind, this is a cliff bracket. You really don't want to be over the thresholds by just a few dollars, unless you mean to through a Roth conversion or something like that. So what happens if you find yourself subject to these increased premiums and you get that notice in the mail? Well, first, don't automatically assume you have to pay them just because you got that notice. It may be possible to appeal and ask for a reconsideration. Now, this is an area that I have very little experience with, so I reached out to an expert for some clarity on this. Danielle Roberts is the owner of Boomer Benefits, which, as far as I can tell, is the leading Medicare agency in the nation. She's grown this company into a large organization, all on the back of providing excellent education on a very complex topic. I asked Danielle to join me and talk about the right way to appeal the notices. Here's our conversation. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me today.
You bet. My pleasure.
Okay, so if someone gets one of these notices, who's going to send it to them?
So, the benefit determination notice comes from the Social Security office. Most of the time, you're going to receive it in the fall, usually December or January, but you'll get your first one when you're aging into 65 as well, and that will be based on your birth date.
Now, what did you call that notice?
There's a benefit determination notice that comes out from Social Security that says, hey, we just looked at your income and we've determined that this is what you're going to pay for Medicare Parts B and D next year.
Gotcha. So you receive that notice, you open it up, you look at it. You may be surprised, you may not be surprised based on, your knowledge and understanding of the rules. But either way, what's the first thing you should do?
So, first thing you want to look and see is, does it reflect a number that you weren't expecting? So, for example, you've probably been doing your research and you figured out that Medicare has a Part B premium that's standard every year, and you may have calculated all your retirement expenses based around that number. And if you didn't know about the income related monthly adjustment amount, which is, Uncle Sam's way of saying you get to pay more because you earned more, there could be a number on there which is a little frightening. Depending on your income, that number can be as much as almost $600 per person for Part B, and it can add on almost $80 to your Part D premium. So it's important that you have accurate numbers. If you get a number that you weren't expecting, then go back and look at what your income tax return was 2 years ago, and it may require a call to Social Security if you think something is off or the number they've given you doesn't mesh with what you were planning for.
Now, Danielle, that raises a point that I haven't covered in the past. We talk about individuals receiving overpayment notices from the Social Security Administration that are sometimes erroneous. But do you occasionally see these notices coming to individuals that just are blatantly wrong?
We don't see that quite as often, but there have been some instances. So there may be factors or information that they're pulling in that just doesn't mesh with what you filed on your tax return. And so in that scenario, it's always worth a phone call to find out what numbers are they working off of.
Gotcha. Now, once they receive that notice, they have a certain amount of time. I believe it's 10 days to respond, right? So if they agree with it, I'm assuming that they do nothing, and within a few days, I think it's that 10-day period,
hmm
then the administration just starts to bill them at that higher rate, or starts to withhold it from their benefit, or starts to send them a bill if they're not already on Social Security benefits.
hmm
All right, so they get past that, but let's say that if they don't think it's right, they want to appeal this.
Yes.
What do they do?
So The 10-day notice seems to be just kind of like a warning. In our experience, we have seen people filing these at any old time, and then this form gets reviewed by a human being who's going to help you decide whether or not you can lower that. So when you get the notice, there's a form that you can find online. It's form SSA 44,
I'll
and
link
the
that up
name of
below.
Okay, and the name of the form is the Medicare Income Related Monthly Adjustment Amount Life Changing Event Form. I have it up on my computer here and it's a mouthful.
Perfect.
But on that form, it's actually pretty easy. It's going to walk you through all the information that is needed. But it's asking you to declare what was your tax return information 2 years ago and what has changed. So you're going to identify certain life events. This could be a marriage, it could be a death of a spouse, it could be the fact that you've retired. They call it work stoppage. It could be the loss of an income producing property. So it could be any of these reasons why you now earn less than what your tax returns reflected 2 years ago. And you could just wait for that to catch up to you. And in 2 years, it would automatically adjust down because you'll get a new benefit determination letter every year. But if you have an income that is lower and they're going to be charging you a higher premium, you're probably going to be highly motivated to go ahead and complete this form and provide them with as much evidence as possible as to what has happened. You've retired and now your income is X, and what is that based on? The more documentation that you can provide, the better. So, if you have a notice from your employer that says the date that you retired, you might have a COBRA form showing when your insurance ended a few years ago, and that can be proof of you retiring. And then any proof that you can provide of your current income. So, this is based on 2 years ago. What was last year's tax return? If you've already filed that, does that show that your income is lower? And then, as I said, a human being is going to actually review that and decide whether or not they will lower that assessment for the Part B and D premiums for you.
So let's talk about that work stoppage for a moment because that's one that I see catches people a lot with this IRMAA. And so let's assume for a minute that I'm working, I'm making $250,000 a year, and I retire. In when I was 63, I made $250,000. I retired going Medicare at 65. That year, my premiums are going to be increased, but
Hmm.
I'm no longer working. I'm no longer making $250,000 a year. In fact, I have no earned income. The only thing I have is my Social Security, maybe a pension, and some distributions from an IRA, but it's nowhere close to 250,000. In fact, I'm under the limit. So, from what you're saying, that sounds like that may be one of the exceptions to the income related monthly adjustment amount. And based on that, they could reduce that or eliminate it.
Yes, and in fact, that is the most common one, and it's also the one that we most commonly see get approved. So it doesn't cost you anything to file this form of Social Security. It's worth a shot, but if the reason is work stoppage or work reduction, where you've gone from working full time to part time, those are the reasons where we most often see Social Security review your documentation and actually approve to have that lowered.
Okay. So let's say I want to take a distribution from my IRA and go on a 180-day cruise around the world. It's going to cost $80,000 to do that. I take that amount out. That drives my Medicare premiums up.
Hmm.
And then can I appeal that? And well, I suppose I could appeal it, but what are my odds at that point?
Yeah, the odds are not very good. So, based on our experience, my client service team helps our policyholders with this. They get them every year, and people will call and they're not sure what to do. And we help them with what sort of documentation to put together and give it the best shot that we possibly can. But the reality is that sometimes Social Security is going to look at that and say, yeah, if you had enough money to take an $80,000 vacation, you certainly have enough money to go ahead and pay a Part B premium that's higher than normal for just this 1 year. So if it doesn't correspond with something, those 8 reasons that are listed on the form, and it's something else, can you file it? Yes, you can, but we don't see those get approved very often.
Got you. So that distribution for going on a cruise is one thing, but the reason that we often see the large distributions come out of an IRA would be a Roth conversion.
Hmm.
And so this is part of the cost that has to be counted when you're looking at doing a Roth conversion, is that not only is it going to drive your taxes up, but it's also going to have the spillover effect into your Medicare premiums. And that distribution would be treated the same as if it would if you were going on that round the world cruise. The Medicare, they're just not really going to care. They're going to say,
Yeah,
listen, you took a distribution, you need to pay this higher premium for at least a year, right? But a work
unfortunately.
stoppage, work reduction, those are two of the reasons that that you can get that done. How long are you seeing that it typically takes? So by the time you file it to get them to approve it and stop, uh, either stop taking out that higher premium or never start taking a higher premium.
Yeah, we typically see it probably take about 2 to 4 weeks, just depending on the local office that you're submitting these to and how long their processing times are. So it may be a few weeks, but the good news is if they reduce it, they will credit back to you any Part B and D IRMAs that you've already paid in those months in between. So you're going to be highly motivated to file this to try to get those reduced as soon as possible. But just know that if they agree with your reason and they do reduce it, they're not going to take 3 extra months and collect that premium from you in the meantime. They will credit that back to you.
Perfect. Well, listen, 2 to 4 weeks is lightning speed for those government agencies. That's for
Yeah,
sure. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me today.
you bet. Thanks for having me, Devin.
So if you haven't yet subscribed to Danielle's channel, you should right here on YouTube. I'm going to link to that as well as a link to her company down in the description. Oh, and while you're down there, be sure to check out the multiple additional resources for you to consider your research about the IRMAA. Thanks so much for watching.